The term fascism is very deeply anchored in Russians. From a Polish point of view, or from a Ukrainian point of view, Pushkin is quite obviously an imperial. If I look at Russian television, I look at Fox, the Fox now looks like the amateurs to me. And
Hello, my name is Mikhail Ziger. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel because every week I speak to the greatest minds of humanity. And today my guest is Professor Timothy Snyder, one of the most famous American historians and the man who has invented the term schizofascism to describe what's happening in Russia now. Hello, Professor Snyder. Thank you for your time. You have invented very important term, schizofascism, several years ago, as claiming that there is a schizofascism in Russia when people who are fascists deny the fact that they are fascists, but on the contrary, blame to be fascists all the rest. Do you think that it's possible somehow, I don't know, psychologically, to get through to the people who are the fascists or under the influence of that schizofascism? Can we explain to them that their new religion, their mindset is fascist?
I think it's going to be hard. So by schizofascism, I meant just a fascist who calls other people fascists. And there, on the one side, you have the actual ideologues like Dugin or Prokhanov, and they know they're fascists. They're perfectly aware that they are fascists, and so you don't have to convince them that they're fascists. They know that they're fascists. But they also know that in a Russian setting, it makes more sense to refer to the West and everyone else as fascists. I think in Russian society and Russian discourse, it will be difficult because the way schizofascism works is in a fundamentally fascist way by defining the other as the enemy. So Carl Schmitt says that politics begins from defining the enemy. What schizofascism does is that it just says the enemy is fascist, the fascist is the enemy. And that means that by definition, we, the Russians, cannot be fascists because we're not the enemy. The other side is always the enemy. And so by using fascist politics, the word fascism gets redistributed. So instead of being a good thing, like with Mussolini, now fascism is a bad thing, but still the fundamental underlying politics is still fascist.
So does it mean that Russian society will never accept the fact that the current Russian politics is fascist?
I think it's a useful argument to have because despite what has happened since 1991, the term fascism is very deeply anchored in Russians. I think it's worth trying to rescue the term fascism as a phenomenon. There's a parallel discussion going on in the United States, by the way, where Americans, for different reasons, also think that they can't possibly be fascists because fascists are Europeans, fascists are people in the 1930s, fascists are someone else, right? It's not nearly as important as in Russia, but I think in both cases, it's worth trying to rescue fascism as a phenomenon because it is a phenomenon, right? There is a way of doing politics which is fascist, and certain people in our contemporary world, Russians and otherwise, fit that definition. So I think it's worth having the argument, but you have to have the argument in a way where it's clear that fascism is a thing, because if it's just I say you're a fascist and you say I'm a fascist and I say you're a fascist, then that's, in that way the word loses all meaning. One has to be able to say fascism is a thing.
That's like you are an idiot, no, you are an idiot.
Yeah, and in that way, see that's a very successful and normal Russian propaganda trick where you just take a word and you make it lose all meaning, fascism, genocide, whatever it might be, by overusing it, by misusing it, by using it all the time. And so if we're going to try to rescue the word fascism, we have to be very careful that we're making it clear that we're talking about a phenomenon that has characteristics like the cult of a leader, the single party state, beginning politics from the enemy, mass propaganda, and all those things fit the current Russian regime. Yeah, cult of the dead.
Yeah,
right, cult of the dead. Yeah.
Okay, but when you wrote the op-ed for the New York Times saying that we must admit that current Russia is a fascist state, what was your objective? Why do you think that it's needed for the West to accept the fact and to say that yes, Russia is a fascist state? Mm-hmm. Does it mean that in today's perception, Western perception, it's impossible to negotiate with fascists? Is it that difference? Like once someone is fascist, you cannot negotiate with him.
Okay, that's interesting. So first of all, you should remember that I'm more of an intellectual than I am a tactical person. And so when you ask me what was the purpose of it, my main purpose is that I just think it's descriptively correct. Mm-hmm. And I think that in politics, it's important to have the concepts laid out correctly and then to think about the political decisions. So it wasn't that I was thinking we can't negotiate with Russia, therefore I'm going to call Russia fascist. Mm-hmm. But it is, I think you have a point. The point was that because
then I think we should just split my question into two different questions.
Yeah, I mean the point is, but you're right in a way, because fascism is not about reasoned conversation. Fascism is about strength, it's about power, it's about will. And it's a very important feature of the history of fascism that nobody ever defeated the fascists in an argument. In propaganda and in ideology, they were very strong, at least in their own countries, all the way to the end. And what finished fascism was not an argument. What finished fascism was a war. And I think in that sense, we are in a similar situation where it's going to be very hard for us to make arguments against the Putin regime. We have to do it. We have to name things by their right names. We have to define the concepts correctly. We have to defend ourselves against the propaganda and so on. But this war is not about some kind of reason. It's not about interests. This war is a demonstration of strength. And the only way you can really respond to a demonstration with strength is to prove that it doesn't work.
So do you think that today the West accepts the fact that Russia is fascist? And is it still, at the same time, is it still possible for Western politicians to talk to President Putin, to negotiate with Russia?
Right. So returning to your previous question, one of the reasons that I put the word fascism out there is that we in the West have a very limited political vocabulary, right? We tend to think only about democracies or failed democracies or half democracies. We had a much richer political vocabulary in the 20th century. Now we have a very narcissistic political vocabulary, which is about one model or the failings of that one model. And so whether we use the word fascism or not, I think it's very important to look at a system like Russia and say, that's not a failed version of our system. It's something else. Mm-hmm. We have to have our own conceptual models to describe that one thing. Now, can you talk to fascists? Of course, people talk to fascists all the time. The question is, when do you talk to fascists and under what conditions? And I think here it's useful. Here I think the historical term is useful because you can talk to a regime which makes it clear that it's all about lies and force after nobody believes the lies and after the force has been defeated, right? And so, yes, I think there will become meaningful conversations with Russia after Ukraine has won the war. But before that, I don't think it's possible.
Can you describe that situation? How do you see the victory for Ukraine, and how do you see how does it look like Russia defeated?
Well, first of all, I mean, Russia has been let me start a different way. America loses wars all the time, and we're still here. We've lost most of our wars since the Second World War. We lost terribly in Vietnam, right? We were embarrassed in Iraq. We were embarrassed in Afghanistan. We lose wars all the time. Russia also loses wars all the time. Lost the Crimean War, lost the Russo-Japanese War, almost lost the Second World War, came very close. Stalin was hiding in a closet. Lost the war in Afghanistan, lost the first Chechen War, right? So great powers lose wars all the time. So what does a defeat mean? A defeat means that the people who run the state have a chance to reconsider because they're forced to reconsider, right? This is just Clausewitz, war is the continuation of politics by other means. Putin tries to export all of Russia's political problems into Ukraine, right? He tries to export all the problems that he himself has created for his own country to Ukraine in 2014. He tries to do it again in 2022. In 2022, maybe 2023, this will not work. The problems of Russia will be exposed by its failure to win in Ukraine. And at a certain point, Putin will realize this is reaching me personally. That's what a Ukrainian victory looks like. When the consequences of the war begin to matter for Putin personally. So I can't say exactly when that's going to be because of the way Russian media work, you know, but it's better than I do, but because of the way Russian media work, Putin can go for a long time telling the Russians that somehow they're winning in Ukraine, which they're not, they're losing. But he can go for a long time telling them that they're winning. But at a certain point, he will realize that this is not working for him. And at that point, he will talk, and at that point the war will come to an end. So I can't tell you, when I say Ukrainian victory, I can't tell you precisely what that means, you know, whether that means, you know, which territories will be controlled by whom. But it means the point when Putin realizes that this war is starting to affect me personally in a negative way.
And the moment when he realizes that he needs it to be stopped.
Yeah, because the Ukrainians have said since day 2 of the war that they're willing to negotiate, but they can only negotiate after they've put the Russians in a position where the Russians want to negotiate. I mean, by the Russians, I mean the Putin regime. And the Putin regime is not there yet.
Let's talk a bit about Russian culture, because for many people who, especially for those Russians who have left Russia, there is a big challenge and at the same time a mission to reconsider, to analyze again and again what we have done wrong and what our predecessors have done wrong. How Russian culture, like Russian literature, is responsible for what is happening and what has happened before. How do you think we all should reconsider, and what do you think we can do or we should do to our perception of classical Russian culture?
No, that's a beautiful question. I think one way to start is by listening to how the other reacts to that culture. So the analogy is by no means perfect, but please permit me to use it. One way for Americans in the dominant American culture to understand what's actually happening in their country is to listen to African Americans. Right? Like African Americans are in there, they have the same language, but because of a historically, let's call it colonial position, they see things which I might not see. I think Russians have that same chance with people from the former Soviet space, the Balts, the Ukrainians. I mean, right now the Ukrainians may not want to enter into this conversation with you, but reading Ukrainian scholarship or reading Ukrainian interpretations, or for that matter, Polish interpretations of the 19th century Russian classics is a way forward. Just to like try to look at the same literature from a different perspective. Like Pushkin is the classic example, where there's a view which holds that Pushkin is neutral universal culture, and you can hear that view expressed. You could hear it expressed even in Ukraine until very recently. You can hear it expressed in Berlin, but from a Polish point of view, or from a Ukrainian point of view, or from, for that matter, from a Caucasian point of view, from the point of view of the Caucasus, Pushkin is quite obviously an imperial writer. And so that's an example of where something which seems universal, if you just look at it from the perspective of, say, Mickiewicz's argument with Pushkin, or how Pushkin wrote about the wars in the Caucasus, you realize that, Pushkin is always presenting the Russians as innocent, no matter what they do. And that is a cultural topos, the idea that even when we're the aggressor, we're always innocent. That is very powerful in Russian culture today. So I'm not an expert on Russian culture, but so that's just one little example and one little trick. The trick to just look at how the class, like Dostoyevsky is another example. Look at how Dostoyevsky looks from Poland. Then that's a start.
And what about new attitude to Russian history? Do you think that Russian history is capable of being rewritten and reanalyzed and using the same pattern? How for example, Americans started rethinking their history. What could be done to Russia?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I think Russia has a very similar problem to America or Britain or France or Belgium or the Netherlands, which is that it's an imperial country that needs a post-imperial or a non-imperial history. And going back to losing the war, it was very important for the Dutch and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese to lose wars. The Germans, 1945. It was very important for them to lose wars because that actually gave them a chance to start rethinking the history. And that is, just going back to your earlier question, one of the reasons why, I mean, no one wants to lose a war, but one of the reasons why it would be good for Russia to lose this war is that would be a chance to start rethinking this history. Because the history that, the myths that Mr. Putin is using to bring Russia into war is exactly the opposite of what you need, right? These stories of innocence, these stories of ancient heritage, these stories of nothing changing, that's not history at all. So, I mean, I think it's very important for Russian history to be oriented, first of all, around multiple centers. So not, there was Kiev, and then Kiev was somehow magically transferred to Moscow, which is insane and has always been insane as interpretation. But the idea that...
Not directly, but via Vladimir.
Oh, right, yes, of course. I mean, we can talk about that more if you want. But the Russian history, for it to make sense, has to have a lot of different centers, as opposed to
like Golden Horde or Novgorod.
Of course, yeah. I mean, Novgorod, Mongolia. Suzdal as its own history, as opposed to somehow magically it inherited everything that was in Kiev, which is a 19th century story that makes no sense. I mean, a Russian history which is not about innocence and continuity, but which is about multiple centers of power and culture and multiple influences. A Russian history which is not about East or West, but which is about Russia, the places in Russia that matter. Russian history is like one of the many casualties of this war, right? One of the many casualties of this regime is Russian history. I mean, Putin sitting in the archives writing his incredibly dumb articles is terrible for history. I mean, taking the word Ukraine out of Russian history textbooks, which is happening, doubling down on all these horribly simplifying interpretations of Russian history, it's terrible. Like it's terrible for Russians. Like Russian history is unbelievably interesting, and because there is this leader and because there's this war, it has to all be reduced to this crystalline legend of innocence.
But at the same time, that's an opportunity because. It's very hard and painful to rethink the whole history of the country. But now after this war, there is no other option.
Yeah.
Like the whole perception of Russian history has been destroyed by Putin, obviously, because he has grabbed it and privatized it. So
Right.
we have to create a new attitude.
Yeah, and you're right. It's if you, I mean, I don't mean to sound too harsh, but if you lose, it's an opportunity. You know, if you win, then not you personally, but if Russia wins, then this narrative continues for another generation. You know, then you're lost for another 30 years, basically. You know, these young men who are fighting in Ukraine, like the story that they're going to bring back from that if they win, you know, will be unhelpful. But you're right, it is a chance. And, you know, it's also a chance for everyone who works in Russian history, because I think in the West, we've contributed to this problem. I mean, we have also followed this model of Kievan Rus, and, you know, and you know, we've taught East European history as Russian history, and we've taught Russian history in a certain way. And so there's this ironic consequence that we too have heavily centralized, or we've made an imperial model of Russian history. And my colleagues who work in Russian history are only now starting to think, oh, perhaps we've made a mistake and we should be decentering all of this.
For anyone who is interested in Russian history, and especially, I guess, for all Russians, the word colonial was always a problem, and Russians could never admit and accept the fact that Russia was a colonial power, and the argument can last forever because we are not like them. We were like, Russia was never exploiting different nations, but was like contributing and helping them, blah blah blah. Yeah. I've heard a lot of argument about that term in Ukraine. Probably that was before the war, but the acceptance of the fact that Ukraine was a colony was something rather hard to absorb in Ukraine as well. And I've heard several people preferring to compare Ukraine and Russia to, for example, Scotland and England, not as a classical metropole and colony. Right. What do you think of that perception of Russia as a colonial power? Is it is it the right term, the right example, or?
Well, okay. So in general, if you say all we did is go out and help people, that proves you're a colonial power, because only colonial powers ever say that, right? Okay. So that argument basically answers itself, because that's everyone says that. That's not just the Russians, that's everyone. That's the defensive version of American history, it's the defensive version of British history. That's always what imperialists say. They always say, we came from the center, we didn't bring our own culture, we brought universal truth. If we brought our own language, it was only because our language serves to convey universal truth. These people were backward and we helped to raise them up, and so on and so forth. Every imperialist always says that, and so Russian imperialists sound just like everyone else, or Russian defenders of empire. So I certainly think that colonialism is helpful to understand the Russian Empire. It's very helpful to understand the incredibly rapid Russian expanse to the Pacific Ocean. I mean, that for me, going back to what's interesting about Russian history, I mean, that moment, that incredibly rapid and early advance to the Pacific Ocean is really interesting and very impressive. But of course, it involves subordinating lots of people and exploiting them economically and looking down on them culturally and so on. That's part of the story, just like, or not exactly like, but similar to the American advance to the Pacific Ocean.
And that happened simultaneously.
Yeah.
The conquer of Siberia and the conquer of the western part of America,
right,
the same years.
Yeah, exactly. So they're similar processes, but they're certainly colonial processes on both sides. Then with Ukraine, I think I agree with the Scotland point. I think it's both at the same time, though. I mean, maybe it's more like Ireland, where there's a famine. There are plenty of Irishmen who take part in the British Empire. On the other hand, there is an imperial famine, right? So I think the Scotland point is true especially for the late Soviet Union, where Ukrainian communists were trusted administrators in Soviet Asia.
And,
right?
Sometimes even more influential than other clans.
Yeah, for sure. But even when that is true, that doesn't mean there isn't a colonial aspect as well. And you can have a colonial administration which involves elevating a certain class of people, right? So the British in India were certainly a colonial administration, but they created a large class of educated administrators who used their language, right? So in the 1970s in Soviet Ukraine, sure, Ukrainians could choose to advance to important positions in the Soviet Union, but there was even in the 1970s, when there's no famine and where the gulag is relatively small, there's still a colonial price to be paid, which is that you're losing your language. Your language is being suppressed in schools. Your language is no longer a language of social advancement.
Speaking about one more important term, I'd like to ask you about Rashism. You've written an article in the New York Times explaining to the American audience what is Rashism and why it is important to know that new Ukrainian term. Just personally, when I was reading that article, I felt that I've got a problem with it because for me it seems like that's not just fascism, but that's probably in a way equalizing the name of the country to the fascism itself. Unlike we didn't have the word Germany in the Nazism in Germany or Italy in the fascism in the 20th century, but now we are like equalizing, and that could lead to some greater consequences and to some greater prejudice, more stereotypical view of Russia as a eternally fascist state.
Yeah, I take that point. I think it in a way it goes back to the schizo-fascism discussion, because the Russian fascists, Russian propagandists had been so successful at using fascism as a weapon against other people. So if you think back to 2014, or even to the entire period between 2014 and 2022, in the West, people said, well, what about Ukrainian fascism? All the time. Always a big discussion. And that was quite a success for Russian propaganda because, of course, there are Ukrainian fascists, but there aren't that many of them, far fewer than in my country or in your country or in the Netherlands or pretty much wherever you want to look. But nobody was saying, what about Russian fascism? So the concept had been successfully exported or, if you like, displaced. Right, it had been displaced from Russia onto Ukraine, and I think the Ukrainians, I think, in a kind of dialectical response, came up with the Rashism because it was a way of saying, yes, there is Russian fascism, and these very things that you're watching in front of your eyes, for example, their invasions of our country, can be understood in fascist terms. Now, in the article. So I find the article interesting. I mean, the word is interesting for me for linguistic reasons, which are relevant to both Russians and Americans. For me, the article was mostly about Ukrainian bilingualism and Ukrainian polyphony and Ukrainian code switching, and about how the Ukrainians mix and match pieces of words. That's and that makes them different from both Russians and Americans, who tend to be monolingual and don't really understand Ukrainian bilingualism. That was the essence of the article. But in the article, I made the same point that you're making now, which is that Rashism, if you apply it, if you say someone is a Rashist or Rashista because of something they do, that's one thing. If you say that a whole nation is fascist, that's something else. So I acknowledge the danger. I mean, what I notice in practical Ukrainian usage is that it's generally in response, right? So if bombs fall in Vinnytsia and kill civilians, then people start using the word. They don't generally say all Russians are fascists, but I take the point. I take the point.
You started using the term fascism several years ago. That is from The Road to Unfreedom.
Yeah.
That was published in 2018, right? did you expect that time that ideology would become the ruling ideology in Russia, and that little group of Dugin and Prokhanov actually won't be the only schizo-fascists?
Yeah, I thought things were going in that direction. I mean, Road to Unfreedom is a book that when people read it, everyone said, oh, not all of my Russian friends, some of them thought it was right, but most Americans read it, said, no, this is going too far, right? And now people read Road to Freedom and they say, oh, you seem to have been writing about the things that are happening now. I thought it was moving in that direction. And one of the things which has confirmed the tendency has been the memory laws, like the way that, going back to our conversation about history, the way that Putin keeps trying to legislate, or as you say, privatize history, which all has the same pattern of making us innocent, making the Russians innocent. And schizofascism is ultimately about how no matter what we do, even if what we do is fascist according to any possible definition, we're innocent, because the word fascism only applies to the other side. So it was already pretty important back in 2014. And in 2014, I couldn't have known that Putin would still be in power in 2022. A lot of this has to do with him and his aging process and the way his own ideas have changed. Because I don't know how you see it, you're much better informed than me. But as I see it, there's always been a kind of ideological Putin and a kind of tactical Putin. But the ideological Putin has become dominant with time, and the tactical Putin, I think, has become weaker. In 2014, there was more of a balance. He did believe some of the things he said, but he also, I think, was in control of himself. Whereas now, I think the whole, again, I'd be interested in what you think, but I think the whole war was based upon essentially false ideological premises in which he believed, and then tactical Putin is having a hard time catching up with the disaster that ideological Putin has created.
Yeah, he used to be very swift and effective in reaction, but now obviously what he's doing is, it's not a reaction to anything. That's his own initiative and his own agenda. At the same time, in your recent interviews, you said that the fact that European countries, like Germany, are not that quick in supplying Ukraine with arms is also the consequence of colonial attitude and inability of Germany to accept the fact that the Second World War was a colonial war, not against Russia but against Ukraine.
No, it's very.
Can you speak about that?
I mean, the Germans. Well, it goes back to the point that we were making in an earlier part of this conversation about how you rethink your own history. And you rethink your own history in part by listening to what other people who were affected say about it. So in the case of Germany, there has been a move to listen to Jewish history, especially German Jewish history. And then beginning with Ostpolitik, there was a move to listen to Moscow about the past, whether that was Soviet Moscow or later Russian Yeltsin Moscow or Putin Moscow. But there was never a move to say, what do the Ukrainians think or what do the Belarusians think? And that's, of course, quite important because the Second World War was really fought out in Ukraine and Belarus. And when people say, Russia about the Second World War, they really mean the Soviet Union and they really mean the Western Soviet Union. So, of course, Stalingrad, Leningrad, horrible battles and suffering in Western Russia, but really Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltics is where the center of the Second World War was played out. The Germans, for a number of reasons, have never really understood that. They have preferred to just look at the Soviet Union as Russia and to give Moscow the 100% of the voice, 100% of the agency, 100% of the subjectivity about everything concerning the war. And that does, I believe, have to do with historical German colonial attitudes towards Ukraine and also colonial practices in Ukraine, which the Russians have very skillfully exploited. And so you have a kind of confluence of German colonial attitudes and Russian colonial attitudes about Ukraine, where the Russians encourage a certain German view, which is that Germany is a great power. It ran up against Russia, another great power. Germany failed, but now we're great powers and we can talk to each other like mature people. We don't have to listen to those Ukrainians down there. And that was very effective until February 24th, 2022. So part of the problem is that the Germans have to do what we were talking about earlier. The Germans have to think about the Second World War as a war which involved Ukrainians or Ukraine, and as a colonial war in which they still have some learning about themselves to do. And to their credit, they have been doing some of that, at least in the last, I mean, they should have been doing it for 30 years, but they've at least been doing it for the last 4 months.
So has the attitude changed really, or as soon as we don't have the Germans rushing to help Ukrainians, is it too slow?
I think something has, well, small question, is it too slow? Yes, it's too slow. I would like this government to act more quickly. I mean, I have a very simple view about the war in Ukraine, which is that it should end, and the only way for it to end is for Ukraine to win, and therefore people should help Ukraine to win, because the sooner it's over, the better it is for everyone. The world doesn't starve, Ukraine isn't destroyed, Russia has a chance to rethink its politics, and so on. And so yes, it should be faster. But on the bigger question, the deeper question, no, something has changed forever. Something has changed forever in German public opinion, thanks to Zelensky and the Ukrainians. It took, no one should have to do as much as the Ukrainians have done in order to be recognized as a nation, but they have now done it, and they've now been recognized as a nation, and I don't think that can now be taken away. Because they stayed, because they fought, because they won the Battle of Kiev, because they're still fighting, they now are in the mental encyclopedia of the German people, and I think, as it were, forever. I don't think that can be undone. So, and this is something we're thinking about also from a Russian perspective, because whatever you try to do, however you think about yourself in the future, the Europeans are never going to forget Ukraine again. They might not make the right policies, they might be selfish and short-sighted and so on, but the idea that Ukraine isn't really a country, that's gone forever. That's gone forever since February.
What do you think about the American attitude, or Western, but especially American attitude to the war? How it's being changed, and do you feel that Americans and people in Europe as well are getting tired of this war and not eager to listen to those news on a daily basis? And
I don't really believe in that. I think there's a kind of journalistic demand for stories about war fatigue. And so we're in the point in the news cycle where we're supposed to have war fatigue, and so everyone is asking about war fatigue. But I don't really notice it. I mean, I think it's completely normal that the stories about the war are not going to be on the front page every day. I mean, they can't be. You know, the war has lasted for almost 5 months now. And it's normal also that Americans care more about inflation. That's normal. I mean, that's completely normal. It'd be weird if they didn't. But two things remain really strikingly important. And if I were the Russian regime, I'd be worried about these two things. The first is that public opinion polls continue to say that America should do more rather than less for Ukraine. And the second is that it's the only bipartisan issue in the country. It's the only thing that people can agree about. And that's visible not just in the visits of Republican and Democratic senators to Kiev, it's also visible in the country itself, where if you can go to Republican cities or Democratic cities, and they will both have some kind of pro-Ukrainian display. If you look at the houses, like, this is a phenomenon which I'm sure is not visible in most Russian media, but there are Ukrainian flags flying all across the United States, and in places where there are Democrats, in places where there are Republicans, in places where there are white people, in places where there are black people, there are Ukrainian flags all over the country. And that's not some kind of like, that's not a top-down thing. That's just Americans with their, who respond to this war with a kind of basic sense that here is a case where the right and the wrong is very simple. And I think I think in a way, like that is why people keep thinking about the war, because it's very clear who's right and who's wrong. It's not a complicated thing, and Americans who in foreign policy are often confused and often have good reason to be critical of their own government. Here they say, well, no, here we have a big country invading a small country for no reason and killing lots of people. And so that I think it's normal that it's less present in the news than it was in February and March, but the way that people think about the war continues to be quite constant. And so if I were, I know that the Russian propagandists, and I think the Putin people too, are counting on the Republicans to win in November and for everything to change. But it's not clear the Republicans are going to win in November. And even if they do, things will change in America. But I think the one thing which won't change is our Ukraine policy.
Mm-hmm. But what about that, let's call it Kissinger's
Mm-hmm.
approach? And we know that it's not only about Henry Kissinger with his personal ties and
Mm-hmm.
his knowledge of President Putin personally. That's the same approach is sometimes heard. I've heard it from several prominent, for example, French
Mm-hmm.
statesmen. It's not really popular, but it exists
Mm-hmm.
in Germany, in other European countries. Is it because of real close personal ties of those probably sometimes corrupted politicians, or is it a sign of another approach to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
probably many people in the West do not understand that that's completely unacceptable for the Ukrainian society to give in, to sacrifice part of
Right.
its territory for the
Right.
sake of the peace.
Yeah, I mean, so I think people hold those ideas for different reasons. I think sometimes I think there's a generational habit, especially among an older generation, to think of Russia as the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union as some kind of unstoppable superpower. And so I mean, these are very different kinds of people, but Kissinger and Habermas and Chomsky, all end up saying basically the same thing. And I think it's
That's such ironic that Chomsky and Kissinger are
now, yes, they're going to, yes, it is indeed very ironic, as you say. But I think a lot of it depends on the idea that Russia is a kind of unstoppable power. And then you have the academic realists who, like Mearsheimer or Stephen Walt, who operate in a world without reality. Like their realism is all about abstractions about states, and it comes down to the same thing because they don't know anything about Russia or Ukraine. They don't speak the languages. They don't think they have to even read the news. They just know that there's a category of great power and a category of buffer state. And so it's like a math problem. And of course, this has to do this and this has to do this. And that is, that position, taking up your next point, that position is fundamentally unreal because wars are decided on the battlefield, and actually since the Second World War, the smaller country has won most of the wars, which is worth remembering. If you're a big country starting a war, usually the small country wins. But and who wins a war is often an open question. It depends upon other things about the ideas that you express. And so if you express the idea, the big country has to win, you may be contributing to what actually happens on the battlefield. But then morally, as you say, it's totally atrocious. I mean, to say that the world is just such that the big country always wins, therefore little countries should give in. I mean, the consequences of that are that genocide is permissible, anything's okay. And just in their daily lives, I mean, it's just a very simple point. The Ukrainians don't care whether American realists tell them that they're a small state and they have to give up. because they know what happened in Trostianets and Bucha and Irpin and Mariupol and countless other places, and no one would want that, right? So it's not just an abstraction of one state defeats another state, it's human life and the loss of life and rape and injury and trauma, and also just subordination. I mean, it's easier to convey the idea of, Bucha and Irpin because, we Trostianets because of the physical destruction of human beings. But if you're a Ukrainian and you know that the aspiration of the Russian government is to make it impossible to be who you are, even if you physically survive, that's a very serious thing. And I think, I don't think Mr. Kissinger or Mr. Walt or Mr. Mearsheimer can really at this point, or Mr. Chomsky, contemplate the idea of a country coming and saying you can no longer be American. You can no longer be who you are. We're going to deport your school teachers. We're going to re-educate your children. We're going to teach you that you're something else. I don't think they even understand what that means. And of course, that's what the Ukrainians are also fighting against. They know who they are. And so it's not just about physical survival, it's also about survival as subjectively who you are, what kind of subject you are. And so that, the realism which wants to reduce everything to these airless abstractions, it's very poor at describing what's happening, but it's also very poor at, it's morally atrocious because it sets aside all of these conditions which help explain why people fight or why they don't fight.
You recently said that the West should use Russia as a check on the way we should be. Explain, please, what lesson can Russia teach the West, or not Russia, but the tragedy that is happening with Russian fascism?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking that, because for me, I'm not an American exceptionalist. Like, I'm not somebody who thinks like America is wonderful and the whole world is and we're separate from the whole world. On the contrary, I think American democracy is very flawed and vulnerable. And the whole premise of Road to Unfreedom was precisely that Russia is a kind of alternative possible future for the United States. So it's not that we should learn from Russia in the sense of seeing in Russia exaggerated or intensified forms of problems that we have in America. So I can name 3 right off the bat. Number 1 is inequality of wealth. Fundamental problem in Russia is that too few people have too much of the wealth. And we in America are going in that direction too. A second problem is centralization of the media. So in Russia, you have one version of this. You have state-owned TV channels and control of the internet. We haven't gone that far, but if you roughly half of Americans get their news from Facebook. We have Fox News, which is a kind of poor man's Первый канал. It's not as good as Первый канал, but it's basically the same idea. Right, and so
actually, we know that they learned it from the Fox News.
Right, but they're better now. They're better now. There's a kind of flow back and forth. But honestly, if I look at Russian television, I look at Fox. The Fox now looks like the amateurs to me. So media and the absence of factual reporting and local reporting. Like, for me, this is a very important thing. What you guys used to do. I've seen reporters from Dost all over the place, right, including in America, like driving around in cars, like trying to cover the stories by going out and being there. That's really important, and that was closed down in Russia. And in America, sure, we have freedom of speech, but freedom of speech doesn't matter that much unless you have lots of reporters, lots of journalists actually doing their job, and we don't have very many actual journalists. We have lots of people talking on television, but we don't have very many journalists. So that's number 2. And then number 3 is, we talked about it before, but the cult of innocence. The idea that we can't do anything wrong. And in America, this is manifesting in all of these laws about what can be taught in. There's no reason why Russians would know about this, but there's a wave of laws basically censoring school teachers and requiring school teachers to, sign loyalty oaths and to promise that they will only teach positive things about certain parts of American history, right? So that cult of innocence is a big problem, because once you say one group is innocent, then you can't really have a democracy, because in democracy you're always self-correcting, you're admitting that you made mistakes. And if you say, no, Russians were always innocent. Russians never fought an aggressive war. All the wars were defensive. Or if in America you say, white people were innocent, that slavery was an accident, whatever. As soon as you start up with the cult of innocence, then you can't really have a democracy, because you're creating a class of people who think that they're always right.
Does America consider itself to be an empire, probably the last empire if Russia is the last but one? Or there is also China?
Yeah. America certainly doesn't consider itself as an empire. I think, and it's moving in that direction. I think it's very, for me, if I can speak in a kind of very general meta-historical way, the big problem for everyone that we're talking about is getting from empire to democracy, and it's not at all easy, because the habit of empire is, as the Romans understood, the habit of empire is inconsistent with the habit of republic. They're different ways of being in the world, and if America is going to become a democracy in the sense of letting the black people vote, if we're going to become a democracy in the sense of recognizing all Americans as equal citizens, we can only do that by way of processing the imperial past. And I think that's true for everyone. I think that's true for Russia too. I think there's only one way, and it's to admit, not to feel guilty. That's not the point. The point isn't to feel guilty and cry. The point is rather to say, okay, if we actually want to have a better society in the future, one of the things that involves is engaging seriously with the past. So Americans don't think of themselves as being an empire, but there is more and more critical thinking about the past, which moves in that direction. I mean, the way not to be an empire is to remember that you were, that's part of the trick. And China is way out at the other end, right? I mean, in China, they also practice a cult of innocence, and they also say, well, we've been the victims forever, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. You said several times that Trump presidential campaign was basically a Russian operation. What do you think of that now? And do you think that Trump can be back?
Well, so
first, was it really in a primitive meaning?
Well,
the Russian operation.
I mean, the Russians didn't give birth to Trump. They didn't send Trump to school. They didn't make him a real estate developer. But at a certain point, rather early on, let's say 2015 at the latest, important people in Russia took notice of Trump and made it clear that it was the preference of the Russian state that Trump be the Republican nominee and be the President of the United States. And resources were put behind this project. And I think that's now beyond any contestation. So, of course, Trump is also an American phenomenon. He got lots of votes, lots of people supported him, and he represents some of the worst parts of America that we've talked about, actually. He represents the exceptionalism and the lack of historical self-consciousness, and the idea that whatever you do, it's always right because you're American. So he's an American phenomenon, but certainly there was a Russian policy to support him. And the election was so close in 2016 that I think it's reasonable to argue that if it weren't for the Russians, he would have lost. A couple of places where I think their support was very important was in suppressing the black vote electronically, and maybe most importantly in shaping the questions in the presidential debates. Because in the last two Clinton-Trump presidential debates, the questions were about things which Russia had leaked. right? So if Russia isn't in there leaking documents, then there's a different presidential debate, and Clinton's not on the defensive the way that she was. So yes, certainly he was their candidate, and the evidence which has emerged since 2016 has only confirmed all of this. But can he come back? As we're speaking, there are hearings about what happened in America on January 6, 2021, which was unambiguously an attempt to carry out an anti-democratic coup d'etat and change the regime of the United States. I think these hearings have made Trump less popular. I think the risk for America in the future is less Trump than Trumpism. So not him personally, but the general idea that some authoritarian candidate should be allowed to rule even though he loses an election. I think that's the danger for the United States. I think Trump is in a difficult position now. I think he's probably now the second most popular Republican after DeSantis. I think if he runs, he loses. I think if he doesn't run, he goes to jail, or he's certainly risking going to jail. So he's in a tough position right now. But generally speaking, I don't think Trump is going to be president again. But I do think it's quite possible for there to be a situation in 2024, which is similar to 2020, namely that one candidate wins, but the other candidate tries to take power.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that America can or will become a schizo-fascist state?
Well, I think it's a good question, because if we were fascist, we would definitely be schizo-fascist. I mean, we would definitely talk about how it's somebody else rather than us. There is certainly a phenomenon of American fascism, and much of what Trump isn't only a fascist, but much of the Trumpist behavior, I think, falls into the fascist category. For example, to give an example we didn't talk about before, the big lie, right? Like Putin now tells big lies. He used to tell medium-sized lies, but he's moved on to big lies. Ukraine doesn't exist.